Hello, welcome to the Winter Dean Salon. My name is Deborah L, and I'm the Dean of the Humanities Division here at the University of Chicago. The Dean Salon is an opportunity for us to talk more directly with alumni, friends, students, and parents about what's actually happening in the Humanities Division, what kinds of problems our scholars and artists think about, play with, investigate, and why that might matter to you. Our fall salon was called Wicked Problems, and it was a conversation between Patrick Jagoda, who is a game designer and media arts scholar, and Dan Holtz, who is an astrophysicist and on the board of the Doomsday Clock. We were thinking about what's moving that clock hand closer to midnight and what the humanities can do about it. That's on YouTube if you'd like to watch it. In the spring, we're going to be talking about cultural preservation with the director of the Institute for the Study of Ancient Culture and the archaeologist Gil Stein. What is happening to our record of the ancient world and how can we hold on to it? Today, we're bringing an artist and a scholar, a historian, together for conversation. And as I was thinking about this conversation and the role of the arts and what we've heard about the humanities, I was thinking, try to imagine a day without art, just one day. No books, no films, no prestige drama on HBO, no music in a concert hall or on your car radio, no art on your walls or anybody else's walls, no video games for your children or probably you too. These are all built out of sustained practice, experimentation, investigation, conversation, and a day without art felt to me like a day full of despair. And so I get the opportunity every day to talk to artists about what they're doing, and I have a feeling you'll enjoy hearing what they have to say. So I want to introduce you to today's conversation partners. Our first guest is Robyn Schiff. She's a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Chicago and a director of the program for creative writing. She also co-edits Canarium Books, which is a small press that produces exceptional books of poetry. Robyn was also the recipient of the Joseph Brodsky Rome Prize and spent a year at the American Academy in Rome. She's written 4 books of poetry: Worth, Revolver, A Woman of Property, and Information Desk, an epic. A Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post and the New Yorker, and an Editor's Choice by the New York Times. Last week, Robyn and Information Desk were named, or I guess it was Information Desk, was named a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. That's one of the big 3, Pulitzer, National Book Award, National Book Critics Circle Award for Information Desk. Ken Moss is a historian of modern Jewish culture, politics and literature at the University of Chicago, where he is the Harriet and Ulrich E. Meyer Professor of Jewish History and the college, and the director of the Joyce Z. Greenberg and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. He is the author of award-winning histories, Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, and An Unchosen People, Volume 7 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture, blah, 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 I'll skip that part. And he co-edits just a lot of other, library data that we don't need to go through. And Moss co-edits From Europe's East to the Middle East, Israel's Russian and Polish lineages with Benjamin Nathans and Taro Turami. So please enjoy the conversation with Robyn and Ken.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you. And thank you to this whole staff who's making this possible. And thank you especially, Ken.
Thanks for letting me be
Debbie
here.
resisted mentioning was that Ken and I were very close friends in high school. So this is a very surreal and fulfilling experience to have this conversation in this context. We actually had a history class together in, not going to say what year.
10th grade, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was,
I'm glad you
but
named
the year
that.
will not, yes, the grade,
the
but not the
actual
year.
year will not be mentioned. And a creative creative writing class, so you can think about who did better in either class. Ken and I decided that I would kick us off by reading from my new book, Information Desk, and tell you a little bit about it. This is a book about my first job after graduating from college, when I worked at the information desk at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. It takes place in the 90s while I was there, but it also takes place in the moment of composition. So it sort of comes and goes in and into the history of the time I was present there, further into the history in an ekphrastic manner to any of the objects that were displayed there, and then back out to the present tense, which much of it was the pandemic while I was writing it, but predating that too. It took a long time to write. It might be nice to hear a little bit about the structure of how this thing was built. So I want you to know it's in stanzas of 6-line syllables. 6 lines, sorry. It's in stanzas of 6 lines, and each stanza is, I'm counting syllables, and the amount of syllables are how old I was when I wrote it. I started this poem in my 44th year on this planet. It took a long time to write, so every year I gave myself 1 syllable, which is a big deal for a poet, 1 syllable for my birthday. But I didn't give this to myself in a linear or a very straightforward way. So if I'd written something that was 44, 45 syllables in a stanza, later I could go back and edit it, and it could have any amount of syllables in that stanza and vice versa. So that's the structure you're about to hear. I'm going to read it's a long poem, and I'm going to read you a somewhat long excerpt, but I'm dropping you right in the middle. There was a cart we used to transport brochures from a storage closet to the desk. You had to steer it back through the Renaissance into a passage that opened in a dark medieval hallway through a door without a handle you backed into after opening one-handed with a key called the number 2 that was hanging from a ball-link chain around your neck. We talk a lot about death, my husband and I. I want to add to the utter absence of the weight that once seemed everlasting of the child asleep upon me that I can feel not feeling, which is the overtaking void circumscribed exactly, the pressure at my nape of that ball-link chain when I bent down to insert the key and turn it, pushing the door open, and the glimmering insignificant beauty of the release of my neck as I withdrew key from lock, stood up, and entered. My mother swam in a man-made body called the Delta Reservoir near the Mohawk River outside Rome, New York. That was the intentional result of the engineered flood of a village called Delta that had been developed into something more than just acreage by 2 men named Stark and Prosper. You are an American girl. Here you are in an American poem, getting in the American water. Let's go under together. I used to get nosebleeds from the pressure. I don't know that I want to get in the poem. There is a ladder, itself a salvage. Let's back down it slowly deep in the quiet American wing of the museum in darkness toward a new closet, not for storage, but installed for public viewing, a woman's wardrobe, private, folded things, ironed, crisp as peeling an orange in sunlight, lit like a refrigerator in a dream with almost nothing in it. Who can stand before it and not divest? Stark and Prosper, starched and proper, stiff and angry, forced and entered, sorted and counted, stored and forgotten, a pull to bottom I associate with dream ending before awakening, not thoughtless, beyond thinking, end of recording, sound of the needle dragging the void. Why should we be afraid? Human consciousness far predates me, oiling the mahogany handrail with my mere presence. Rembrandt, not Rembrandt, 1995, was the first special exhibition I attended as museum employee. Paste it with the proprietary edge of a paid informant. Submit everything to the binary. It had the stiff infrared soul of connoisseurship. Rembrandt, not Rembrandt, that's the question. Posed it like a strobe with the typesetter solidus, the forward slash, a force field between who did and who did not make it without that indecisive human or Milton imposes between the given and the made. Eve withdrawing from Adam with such garden tools as art yet rude, guiltless of fire had formed, or angels brought. Choose a side, poet. Which is it, Eve or God who forged the hoe? Forgery, 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 flash, flash, flash. I said to myself, if you have to ask, but I stood before each painting, eating half shadow, umber, and ochre every day for a month of lunch hours, trying to know. The handling of the built-up impasto is itself a valid argument against, writes the curator, Walter Liedtke, in the exhibition catalog, forgery, and yet a few paintings over, Portrait of a Man, the auctioneer. It is surprising how successful the unknown painter was in imitating Rembrandt's manner in the light effects of the sitter's left cuff. And so I came to love that cuff, its lace and dust, and love the wrist that cuff suggests, obscured here in the painting by the ledger the auctioneer is holding, on which the trembling value of what? Some cows suggests a field in mind where a calf moves in the shadow of a barn, the hot smell of manure and mulch, a bull. How much is it all worth? Self-portrait of the young artist as auctioneer with your checklist and radiant left cuff that Rembrandt couldn't have better lit. I see you. I think I touched that cuff and more at a keg party in Sloanham Woods and sensed its tragic aptitude, counterpart to your dull right wrist, lacking the vision of an artist's truth. Is that the word? Truth? Follower of Rembrandt, I followed you into the blue woods, but I changed my mind. There was a museum guard who would not leave me alone in the Rembrandt, not Rembrandt show. Like everyone, he used his breaks to flip through the black binder of better jobs, human resources left out on a table for us, and was eventually transferred to the Department of Design to walk the collection with a power drill, tightening the lucite fixtures that held brochures. He was peculiar, and I was afraid of him. When he asked if he could sit beside me in the employees' cafeteria, situated down a private access stairway beneath the small scale models of a prosperous and tedious imagined hereafter of a Middle Kingdom civil servant served by a labor force of affectless miniature ghosts, trapped in menial afterlives on boats and gardens, slaughterhouses, cattle stables, and a cramped granary divided into two tight rooms, separating those hoisting sacks from scribal clerks squatting on the granary floor, recording each ounce of grain. I could not find my no. So down he put his tray, and we talked a while. He did something obscene, I don't remember what, with a red cherry tomato. 2 months later, he was led out of the museum in cuffs on a date rape charge, which seemed so new then, but as a phrase was coined in 1973. So technically, is as old as me. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you for patiently listening.
No, it's always a privilege. It's not the first time I've had a chance to read that. I'm sure people at home are sharing my sort of sense of the need to sit and absorb some of that. And you started by talking about form in such a playful way, a self-referential way. I mean, adding a syllable for yourself, which is lovely. And then I think it's safe to say that whatever sense of play you evoked in our viewers and listeners was soon burned off or maybe refined, in the fire of that poetry. And you put into play such a troubling and incredibly wide range of troubling phenomena that you want to think about in the poem. And you bring to bear so much knowledge, so many kinds of perspective, so much information, right? As it were. As it were. Yeah, and I mean, it seems to me so much, and especially in this book, but maybe in all of your books, you want your poetry to investigate, to sort of look underneath surfaces, reconstruct the histories and all the ugliness of those histories that made something, look under the surface of selves and understand what made them, objects as well. And I guess, so I think my viewers probably have the same question I have, which I guess is the basic question that any poet thinks about and that's always directed a poem, which is how does form and this kind of formal attention serve the task of crudely content or of thinking, right? And I wonder if we can kind of go through some of the moves you make just in that part of the poem we read.
Sure.
And maybe just conversationally can tease out what you're doing at any moment, and that could take us many more minutes than we have, but maybe we'll just start and see where we end up.
Sure.
Okay, I mean, so you start us with this cart transporting the right kind of information about art and history.
I'm like, what page are you on? Wait, okay.
Right. You lift the key off your neck, and this provokes this association of weight and death and family and motherhood that just erupts into the poem. My husband and I talk about death, right? And then you speak into the record. You say, the poet speaking says, I want to add. So first of all, what are you adding? Why are you speaking in the present tense here?
Thank you. Sometimes we presume that the poet knows what they thought about and shows up to the page having had a thought and then presents the thought, or having had an emotion and then comes and writes down the emotion. And there is something of a romantic model of that. But I'm really interested in a poem that's sort of thinking as it's doing, that writing is thinking, and this is all the arts. Making is thinking, that in the motion of this and going sort of seeing where the poem is going to take me, form in particular allows me as a poet to forget about what I think I wanted to write and to go toward what some sort of subterranean who knows what will take me to, because when one is paying very close attention to counting the form, the imagination is free to do what it needs to do, and those needs are probably for a poet greater than the needs that you think you want to achieve. So, being in that moment, and it's almost like being underwater, being in the flow, being in the total zone of composition. And then every once in a while, and I'm glad you picked up on it, it's important to me to sort of come up and look around, like, I was just making something. I was making, and then I look up and I'm like, I feel like I have to record that too. And it does show up in the history of poetry in like really great ways. It's like, it's Keats and The Living Hand. A great example is my favorite James Schuyler poem. He's writing this long, great poem. He's usually like looking out the window and commenting on something, and he's a New York School poet who I love. And he says, apropos of nothing except the feeling of his own body, my typewriter is sticky. I just ate an orange. And then he just goes back to the poem. But to me, there's almost a sort of feminist ethic, I would say, about acknowledging the conditions in which one is writing. So there are a couple of points in the poem, and they're later than what I've read and what you've asked me about, but I reveal a few stanzas later that I'm actually writing that at an artist's retreat. I'm in Saratoga Springs at Yaddo, this great, incredible place for artists to grow and thrive, and that's a crazy privilege that I get to write the poem there. And I felt like by bringing that into like the moment of the poem would help me. This is a book about art. It's to think about the conditions in which we make art. And there's another point in the poem when I'm sort of deep in trying to figure out something, and it's this long passage about my mother, and it's like hard. And then the doorbell rang, and it was the Amazon guy delivering a vacuum. And I decided to just write it in, because the poem is going through so many histories and there's so many present tenses too, that there's the now of writing the poem, but if the poem takes 4 years to write, how do you count for now under those circumstances? So I just tried to play with it, and the poem is tragic and hard and moves through a lot of harrowing histories, and I think it's funny to take an Amazon delivery in the middle of that, and if it happens to be for a vacuum, perfect. Sometimes you're like in the zone, and it all just sort of adds up. But thank you for that.
Well, there's so many places I want to follow, so many different leads there. I mean, you make reference to surfacing, and there's a moment actually in the part you read where you invite us, or as it were, compel us to do the opposite. You say, let's go under together, right? We're going to actually be submerged.
That's right.
And it feels dangerous, and it feels like you don't want to be submerged there, sort of with your mother, swimming in this place that's somehow at the interstices of all sorts of Americas, Mohawk and Rome, and
yeah.
So
that's like what it's like to be in that museum of like, how do you stay in the mode of what you're looking at, and there's all this chaos of juxtaposition. And you pointed to a part of the poem about going down, and there's actually a line about a ladder. I said, there is a ladder. And it's just a direct quotation from a poem by Adrienne Rich. It's diving into the wreck. And in that poem, it's really important that Rich get herself into the water. And it's this poem about it's the beginning of this new feminist history that she's about to write, that she's embarking on. She was a great breaker of formal structures. She changed her life, and she changed American poetry with it. It's an amazing moment, and so I needed something to hold on to as I went on exactly that point that you mentioned in the poem. So I took Adrienne Rich's ladder.
Good, as long as you give it back eventually, right?
I'll give it back. We can share it. That's the thing. That's poetry.
I mean, so you've invoked several times thinking about feminisms and thinking about history through that lens. You invoke here this world of domesticity, labor, display, a kind of very confined woman. You invoke the refrigerator as you look at this. There's an incredible image. We were looking at this display, and you, I suppose, display about the sort of the 1820s or 30s, but you imagine the object of the 1950s that epitomizes, labor saving and the good life, and yet obviously, right, it embodies certain kinds of domestic labor that are going to have to happen. And we have that image.
We do,
Maybe
and
we'll
it's
talk
not.
About.
Can you cue the image that we've got ready? Thank you very much. It's actually, I compare it to a refrigerator, and I want to make sure I get the artist's name right. So I'm looking for my note here. There it is. This is an image of Sarah Berman's closet. And it's a temporary exhibition that was installed in 2017, 2018, something like this, at the Met, in the American Wing, in the period rooms. And so this is a photograph of the artists who are, I'm gonna want to make sure, Alex and Myra Kalman. They're our mother and son artist team, which touches my heart. And this is their grandmother and mother's closet. And it's installed in all of that pain of the period room. So if you've been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I'm sure you have, you go to the American Wing, and if you keep sort of creeping around and it gets darker and darker, you get into these amazing, Gilded Age kind of period rooms of all this wealth. And anybody who knows this much about American history knows the incredible pain that you're also looking at, all this ugliness of history. This is the part of the museum I go to most. It's exactly the experience that I need to put myself in the place of writing. But it resonates with me that you picked up on this moment in the poem, because it's really hard to find Jewish history down there, and in an obvious way, and also Jewish women's history. This closet belonged to Sarah Berman, who left Belarus in the 30s, escaping the violence of that we know about, that you write about. Landed in Tel Aviv with her family, and then went back and lived in the US when her daughter was married, with one suitcase. And this is the closet that this artist grew up, in her adult life, looking at. And it kind of amazes me. It's all of the incredible ornate surfaces that one experiences in the period rooms just end. And you look at this, and it was, imagine, roaming around that museum, knowing what you know is there, and coming upon this. So it really changed the course of the poem for me, and I realized that this was not just a poem about the Met. It was not just a poem about American history in the Met. It wasn't just a poem about European, old master paintings. It was a poem about me being in that museum. And I had to bring my sister back. Be like, you gotta see this closet. It looks like grandma's. And if you look at the top shelf, I love it. It's sort of a deconstructed body. On the top shelf, it has some hats. And on the second shelf, there's a Chanel number 5, like as if where her neck would be. And then if she were to be standing still, there are like, I can't see it from here. I think there are 3 watches where her wrist would be, and then all these shoes on the bottom, and it just really stirs me. But the Chanel number 5 in particular has got my name on it. I've written about Chanel before. She's a major figure in fashion history. She's also somebody who, during occupied Paris, decided to stay there and lived at the Ritz with her Nazi boyfriend. So it's a really complicated bottle of perfume for me. And in I guess the ambiguity of that luxury product and my disdain for it at the same time, and I can't give up Chanel. What, am I going to never wear a cardigan again? I mean, it's just, I feel like it's the whole book I wanted to write in miniature, and that's it.
Wow. Well, that was a revelation. I'm so glad you walked us through that. I did not catch that, and I should have really understood better what this was. But that's
Well, I don't mention it in the poem, so thank you for picking up on it. But it's in the notes. But there's so much in the poem, it couldn't all be surfaced, I suppose. But you picked up on it being compared to a refrigerator, and I don't know why exactly, except all of the commodity, all of the sort of ugliness, all that sort of just, I don't know, holds still and stark in this installation just moves me.
You made reference just now to the way in which this ties in, the Chanel number 5 ties into some of the moves you made in your very first book.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a book that, like this book, like so many of your books, really wants to think intently about tangled histories.
Yeah.
And I guess, you've begun to talk about why one would use, or not why, how one would use poetry and the power of form to think about these things. And at the same time, you kind of, it's not far from me to doubt the poet when the poet explains how the work works, but you're clearly not doing sort of automatic writing. You're clearly, an incredible amount. There's a kind of element of research and inquiry and recursivity and lots of thinking. And at the same time, you tell us that part of the thinking happens through form. And so maybe, can you talk more about, I'm sure it's very hard to characterize your own method, but can you talk about how forethought and inquiry and knowledge and the power of form itself, all these work together to produce the kind of poetry you're producing?
I'll try.
Okay.
Whoops. I do think that poetry and all the arts really are kind of a machine that makes us think things and then learn more about ourselves and the rest of our lives also, that they are sort of self-knowledge machines. I often start in description of something, and this book was so easy to play that game because I was at the Met, or it's pretending that I'm still at the Met, although I wrote it in a variety of cities, not New York. Once you start seeing something, you start describing it, and then there usually is a point where I've described myself into a corner, and I'm also counting my syllables. I'm like, I've hit the end of this line, and this need to attend to the formal structure of the poem, and also the need to know more usually sends me on some curiosity romp outside of the poem to figure something out, and then back to the poem, and then I write it, and then doesn't feel quite true or right, or hasn't gone far enough, or it doesn't sound right, because when you're writing a poem, you're juggling a lot of things at the same time. You've got your content and your, the sensorium, you've got your sonic values of what this is going to sound like when you're reading it, and then what is actually adding up of how does it mean? T.S. Eliot said something like, content is the bone you throw the dog so you can get inside and rob the house. And I'm totally misquoting this, and I quote this often in my classroom, and I always say, please find the correct quote, students, and then they do, and then I forget it all over again, so somebody should look that up.
So it's actually in Latin.
I like the way I misremember it more than the way he wrote it, but it's true what I say about content, which might be a horrible sounding thing to a real historian, but it's true. And so is form. So if content is the bone you throw the dog so you can get in and rob the house, I would say form is like the incredibly juicy steak so that you can really distract that dog for a very long time and that you can get in there and actually do what you need to do. And the form of a poem can teach you how to think. And it's hard to explain in syllabics, but I think I can explain it with a sonnet. And we do this in my classroom sometimes if I'm teaching intro to forms. If you write something, you sort of explore, you're wanting to explore something in the shape of a sonnet. Let's give you an English sonnet. So you've got your 12 lines, you're doing your thing, and then you've got your turn and your couplet at the end. And there's a certain kind of argument making that's going to happen. You come into your classroom or you tell or to your best self, and you're very proud of your sonnet. And then I have the bad news that you have to turn it into an Italian sonnet. Exactly. And it absolutely changes the mode of argument because it changes proportion. So you can't.
8/6 Italian sonnet?
Yeah. So it changes the way that you have framed your material, your emotional life, the information, the content. You just have to totally rethink it because you can't mean what you meant when you did it the English way. You have to mean this new thing because the proportion is your self-thinking. And this can happen in, it's not just those received forms, but if you count anything, it gives you a way to distract yourself so that you can get in there and let the imagination do what it wants to do. And this might this could happen in stanzas, where your stanza breaks are, how your sentences are interacting with line, all of those kinds of things. Attending to those, they're not really surfaces, but those very formal, attending to the architecture so that you can get to the spirit of the thing.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what you've brought in the classroom, and I think that's what we're here for.
We do teach here.
We do teach here. Do you want to talk about how you externalize these questions to you? So you've already begun. That's it's a wonderful. It's just a lapidary example. Right? This is a form. You've made meaning work in relation to it, and if I change the form, the meaning has changed. But is that sort of?
Yes, but so that's an exercise, and we're not always doing an exercise, but a student might come in office hours just last week. It just felt like all the thinking was happening between stanzas, and he hadn't written that part yet. Everything that was written was really good and solid, but they were blocks of experiences, and it just seemed like if he changed the line length, if he could just push those in a little bit, surprise himself with the way something sounded, and lose those stanza breaks, that there would be a point that would reveal an opportunity to find a trap door out of what one wants to say into what one doesn't know they want to say or didn't even know. But I'm more interested in how you bring poetry to your classroom, because you're not a regular historian. You're a historian who, in any way, but, and I don't know what a regular historian is, but I just made that up. But you teach poetry. Why do you teach poetry? How does this come up?
I do teach a lot of poetry, although now that I've heard how an actual poet thinks, you can't sit in on the class or anything.
We're going to co-teach. Are you kidding me?
There's sort of a banal answer and a maybe slightly less banal answer. The banal answer is the people I study took poetry very seriously, and some of my work has been around the once very large Jewish community of Eastern Europe, Sarah Berman's folks, and this was a community where classical Judaism, an intense kind of religious Jewish life, flourished, but then in the era of both secularism and nationalism in the 19th century, there's a profound rupture for some of these people, and an entire generation that turns its back on the entire sort of idea that this was a divine revelation, and the creative task that's incumbent on the human, the highest creative task is commentary. Because if you believe that God has spoken to you through this book and has a plan, then commentary is the stance you should take. And there's a generation, they're sort of Nietzscheans, even before they discover Nietzsche, who really renounce all of that, and at the same time discover, in a very starry-eyed way, poetry. They're often reading Russian or Polish or German poetry. They're rediscovering poetic resources in their own tradition. Of course, the Bible is full of incredible poetry, but sort of they didn't know that in a way. They'd been taught not to see it qua poetry, right?
Yeah.
And they really deeply believe, and anyone who studies other folks in Eastern Europe in the same period will hear resonances. They really believe that the poet is a kind of secular seer, or at least is called to be, or they hope the poet will be. And that's true.
Turns out.
Well, I could tell them in retrospect, they feel much better. But yeah, and they look to poetry to be the site of a kind of secular but sacred experience of the world. They have this entire Nietzschean vocabulary of vitality and unstoppering of creative vitality. And and then of course they find things more complicated, but they're deeply invested in the idea that poetry will be the sort of bearer both of their new selves, their secular selves, and for many of them of a sort of a nation. This is a nationalist project too, in many ways. So I teach the part because it'd be silly to teach these classes without poetry in the same way that you couldn't teach a class in the 60s and not talk about rock and roll or what music meant. It doesn't make any sense. It'd be a failure, basic historical failure. So it's just empirical at that level. At another level, I can't, alas, share their sense that the poet's always a seer, although I'm willing to accept their exceptions. But I also find, stepping back from the particular people, that, and this is maybe comes back to where I really am, not just moved, but find myself thinking when I read your poetry. I mean, this is a group of people who, like many other people across the globe in the 20th century, and not just French, they live, in a history that's often very violent, and more generally, that's sort of bigger than you are and crushing. And they live in a world where it feels like all kinds of forces that they can't quite understand are moving back and forth and shaping their lives, usually in ways they wish they were not to be shaped. And like icebergs, right? And they do look to poetry repeatedly in the hopes that the poet is discerning some of the ways these opaque forces work underneath history. What's the relation between sort of the violence of in personal life and the violence around us, right? The questions that they ask, they look to poetry a lot, and I think students resonate to that, maybe because they live also in unsettled times.
Can you imagine that being like what we're doing now? Like this national project of like, let's all read poems and we'll figure out how to get ourselves out of this mess.
Funny you should ask.
How do your students respond to being presented with poetry as a sense that there was a time that poetry, I guess, mattered?
Well, I think it still does, but I think some of them are skeptical, but I think most of them come to agree. I mean, if one's doing it well, you give them just enough context that the poem can speak, because he's come out of worlds they didn't really know.
Do any of your students acknowledge writing poems?
I have had a couple students who acknowledge writing poems, but I'm mean-spirited. I don't allow much creativity in the writing response.
Send them to me.
That's right. They can come to you.
I think we should do maybe a series of classes. First, you teach them how to read it, how to trust it, how to understand that it's not to be trusted, and then we'll transcend that together in my classroom. But I'm going to send mine to you as well.
Excellent. I really do look forward to it. And I love teaching poetry, and I love reading poetry. And I guess I'd also want to say that, to come all the way full circle and come back to the poetry that you write, and not just in this latest book, although it's truly a magnificent book. But,
thank you.
One of the you are like these poets that I read with the students. You insist on engaging questions that are not just in a philosophical register, but are very much questions of the things people do to each other and violence, and where the kind of broken life that a lot of people live comes from, and where the beautiful things that we love come from. And at the same time, you do something really quite striking and strange in Information Desk, and I'd like to invite you to kind of close with that. It's structured as 3 long chapters of this epic, but each of them is prefaced by a incredibly acutely observed sort of PBS nature poem about 3 kinds of particularly unpleasant and disturbing wasps, and just full of lapidary detail about these wasps. Would you read one of these wasp poems? Then maybe at the very end we'll have a chance to think, well, what is this bit of natural history doing in Information Desk?
Okay. I'm going to read to the oak gall wasp.
A fine wasp.
I know it. There are 3 wasps in this book. This is the second of them. The first wasp that I was studying, I studied because it became my muse of precision. That sometimes when you're writing, you things become blurry, or you don't see the truth, or you don't have a sense of verisimilitude that one needs in order to depict the world and also make a world out of art. So I was sort of, appealing to this muse. But then the more research I did on wasps, I realized there are multiple wasp agendas. So this is the second wasp poem, To the Oak Gall Wasp. Something like a wooden pearl, what gall forms here? Irritation's gemstone on the oak leaf underneath I thought was a berry seed case, or oak-faced scrotum-like excrescence the oak tree seemed to make of itself in extremis involved with power. For no reason when we were girls plucking these woodland BBs from the branch to flick at the back fence, about so much unsuspecting I was mistaken by dissemination meticulously more single-minded than the mere widest distribution of seed over the furthest expanse as I follow American history, small and solitary, intravenously driven living syringe mainlined into the green vein of oak leaf to position with the earthly pulse of her otherworldly self-sufficient, piercing ovipositor, her shimmering eggs, the oak gall wasp is un-American, Mother of the Year. Patriotism meet parasitism. A biochemical je ne sais quoi charms the redirection of the oak leaf's force to form a cradle for each minuscule egg, something like the way our human flesh scabs over, and not just any oak. Oak gall wasps overtaking an oak known as your own are implicit in every acorn, including the sprouting one you carried home rolling slowly around the base of a wet Dixie cup your first grade teacher told you would, with patience, be as tall as you one day and capable in time of crushing you in bed. Unsentimental consequence of gravity, which is the consequence of the curvature of space-time, but what isn't? I sold the house behind which my son and I once planted such an acorn, and even enclosed it in a pathetic ring of prefabricated fencing. I fought counterclockwise against the coil to unspool off a metal roll like a robot fabric bolt to shield it from the orphan fawns. If that oak rises still, witness to the sleep of someone else's child now through an underestimated August storm I do not know or in what health, but if rise it does, safe in her hyperbaric chamber, as some athletes sleep between stages on the Tour de France, there the gall wasp grows in my divestment. Such a fundamental hunger stirs in the oak gall dark. If you listen, you might hear her chew her way out of oak leaf where she incubates, encrypted in her first meal. Unless, and this is life on earth as much as a miracle of drudgery and lust as you or me or the gall wasp, another even more strategic, parasitic to the second power, brood parasite wasp, oak injects with finer, more exacting ovipositor, a second egg. The two sister together in the wasp world prenatal ritual juices, downloading the vital redirected principles of oak into their maturing, crackling bodies. You've been to sleepovers. Girls grow strong, touching each other's bodies with stories of mutual incrimination. What confidence betrayed then when duplicitous behind her back? To emerge, as we learned, wasps chew their exit through the gall. But in the case of a hosting wasp, she's compelled to stop by something most entomologists do not read enough Victorian novels to understand. Whether social dynamics are more or less legible to an outsider, I'm too far inside the gall to tell, since it was I who dug the hole, placed the acorn, chewed the beast, and waited for the oak to leaf, that the gall wasp could deposit there her egg, inspiring thus the oak to cradle it, that a second wasp could parasitize the parasite wasp, as is drawn out over several seasons of elaborate outmaneuverings in parish, parlor, and palace on the BBC. But this is an American transition of power. Don't look away. I don't want to end this poem bleeding, but the wasp does eat the wasp, and up through the top of her head, like the goddess she is, enters the hellscape. It's happening now. It happened, unless that is through the bedroom window where sleeps the child of someone else now, the beautiful oak I tenderly tended, already crashed. Thank you for asking for that talk.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Great, the timing is excellent. Thank you so much for that. We have some questions, and I want to make sure we have time to answer them. So we have a question. We have a lot of parents on the call.
Oh, good.
On the Zoom, and I think I can translate this question.
Okay.
Yeah, from its many different idioms. Our children are really eager to major in creative writing. Will I be supporting them for the rest of my life? And
would you like my mother's phone number? No.
No. So I can answer a brute fact question about that. In the last couple years, our creative writers went to Accenture, Adidas, they're software engineers at Amazon, they're Fulbright scholars, they are at Harper's Magazine, The Point Magazine, Simon & Schuster, Walt Disney, all right, that's cool, NPR, and Capital Partners, McMaster and Carr, these are both financial analysts, so we don't really have to worry about where they're getting jobs. And maybe we can ask them for some money.
Everything you say makes me think internship. I'm glad you think money, I think experience.
Well,
it might not be obvious, but it's obvious to me, and this just plays out in the studies. Business, entrepreneurship, entertainment, gaming, law, medicine, love writers.
right, true.
Some of those writers double majored, but
A lot of them.
we also happen to train really creative thinkers, really patient people. That just the experience of sitting in a writing workshop is an experience of learning diplomacy. You sit around a table and you learn how to listen to people, and you learn how to take a kind of feedback for your poems and use it or not, but politely accept it. You learn a lot of hard things about the most precious thing to you, which might be the piece of artwork you made, or it might be your memory, or it might be whatever. Though that's not a job that makes you go out and write poems only, although I do think of that is a calling. It's a vocation and an avocation, as Frost said, but it's also all of these ways of thinking are incredibly important. So that's how I would say for those who want to take their poetry training. It's all writing. We teach fiction and nonfiction too.
Yes.
I'm a bit self-centered here. Into some other world. But I also think that the major has a responsibility to the literary community. Yeah. I think about the entire sort of network of what it means to be a professional writer as, you know that parachute game we played as kids? Like you stand around the big round parachute and it majestically goes up, and like one or two kids at a time get to stand in the glory of that moment. That's your publication.
Right.
That's awesome. Nothing feels like that, but you do have to acknowledge that it's being held by everybody else in the community. So we need to train, literary editors, and we need to train a reading series, and we need to train entrepreneurs who will open a small independent bookstore so that if you were to write something, that there would actually be somewhere someone could get it.
Right.
And all sorts of, other kinds of callings of
There's a
keeping
whole
art
ecosystem,
alive. Exactly.
right? The poem doesn't go from your head to the bookstore.
Exactly.
On its
And
own.
we can train people to get to the best MFA in the country. We do that. We do that all the time. But and that's amazing, and that's the incredible fulfillment of this work. But I'm also really excited about my students who say, I'm a chemistry major. I love art, and I don't know what to do about this. I feel like I'm living two lives, and I can say there's no way to live. Like you have to do both at the same time. And one of my greatest triumphs is suggesting to a student in that exact situation to be an art conservator.
Right,
It's like, you can live in the arts and be a chemist. That's a job.
Right.
So
yeah,
I want to
great.
put them together.
Great.
More questions.
More questions.
One for Ken.
No, this is for both of you, okay? So, what responsibilities do you feel when writing about an event or person from the past? Do you remove or keep your modern filter, or how do you know that your judgment about something is very much a historical perspective, right? Then someone in the night, you were both talking about, okay, people in the 19th century believed this about poetry, and do our students recognize that? So that's a little bit about that filter. But can both of you write about things that are histories of tragedy in many ways, not only, which is also present in your work, but sort of, how do you think about that responsibility?
Well, I think most historians hope that the essence of their responsibility is, first of all, trying to get it as right as they can and not falsifying anything. There's a more complicated problem of how to, understand how people thought under different circumstances and different set of assumptions. I guess I think I've probably had it easy in the sense I've tended to write, not always, but mostly about people I generally sympathize with. Mm-hmm. I think my colleagues who work on people that they rightly think ill of, it's actually in some ways harder for them. I think my sympathy extends primarily in the sense of I feel obliged to treat the people I study as no less serious and thinking people as we'd like to be imagined to be. And that's something, this is maybe a discussion that moves in a different direction that we don't need to spend much time on, but I think a lot of history writing requires us to see things that the subjects didn't, and to judge them for, foibles and choices that maybe we're no better, but we are called to judge them in some ways, or we're in a position to judge them, and maybe they need to be judged. And whether a historian's judgment matters is a different question. But so there's a tension, I think, between wanting to be able being able perhaps to understand people's motives and the world of things and forces that move them better than they could have. That's part of what we actually have to do.
Right.
And at the same time, trying to keep faith with them as sort of fellow human beings who are also trying, all else being equal, to sort of understand their world and muddle through. I think those are the kind of tensions I feel in my own work.
Great. Robyn, you have it in both, let's say, a historical and personal plane.
Yeah.
How do you?
I like what Ken said. It feels like it's all the same, except then add imagination. And I suppose that there must be a historian's imagination. And he says, you have to, and I know you have an imagination, but on the page, you have to be able to think through their choices that somebody is making in time. And I guess that the project of writing, or one of the ways of writing about any historical figure or moment or item, object or whatever, for a poet is to, it's that I'm holding on to, of how do I think around what I know? And what I know is from reading a text that somebody like you wrote. And what is that? So it becomes a point of, I'm compelled to say more, to think more, to feel more. So it's a matter of, it's not changing the truth of the record, it's just imagining through it in almost a scene way. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I recognize that from literary criticism, is that you have to spend part of your time living in their way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's hospitable to you or not, right? You have to not read into them what you want or need to see, right? And so you have to give it over, but then ultimately you got to come out of it, right? Because you're not their PR agent, right? But it's...
And this is where poetry gets to have all the fun, because you do exactly that and
you
exactly
don't have to come out on the other side.
No, and I get to do these asides and say what I want about it. So I get to keep the contemporary lens and really loudly about it. And I don't know where the first person comes in history writing.
my general view is it oughtn't very much.
Right,
You know,
that's what I would presume.
Precisely because, as you said, but I mean, there's something deeply responsible for the historian to make the past do what the historian wishes.
Right.
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 But at the same time, right? Maybe that puts more onus and it makes more complicated the task of the poet who wishes to engage directly with the historical. I mean, you set yourself up for difficult. I mean, you face yourself with challenges. In your first books, you had very kind of robust, informationally thick historical sort of objects and conceits, and you decided to engage them rather than,
Yes,
the easier thing
absolutely.
like writing something unrelated.
Yeah, right. But I get to learn, we were talking about the mode of thinking that poetry is, or art making is. In the mode, I can ask myself, what do I know and what do I need to know, and now what do I think, and surface that in a way that it isn't in your discipline to do so. But that's like the whole thing for the poet. Like I pick up what you know and then sort of ask myself aloud, like what on the page, like how do I deal with that? How do I, we were talking about Chanel, like how do I deal with that? So, what I think poetry can do is sit in ambiguity and sit in contradiction and hold what we know is absolutely wrong about historical figures. But I can admit to myself that there's an allure there. Mm-hmm. Why am I attracted to this? And that seems to be what most of my poems are about. God, that's beautiful, and I hate myself for loving it. That's that should be on the back cover.
I totally understand that one. So we had one question from, I think, must be a creative writer. Is what should you do when you can't find anything to write about?
Read. Do you have an answer?
I agree.
Read.
Read.
Okay. Yeah, I'm 100% in favor
describe.
of that.
If you're reading and you feel like picking up pencil, just describe something.
Yeah.
Just go somewhere and look and describe something. And I would add to that, draw something too. My colleague, Ryan Van Meter, who's a fantastic poet, nonfiction writer, I'm sorry, I keep privileging poetry. I think he's a poet too. But he said, every person on earth should take a drawing class. Right. And I know that that's right, because it teaches us how to see.
Well, I did an interesting thing in a class, which was given to, exercise was given to me by Neil Verma, who was a colleague here for a long time and is now at Northwestern, and he teaches radio. And so whenever I taught this radio drama, I would have the students draw what they heard. And that was fascinating, because it gave them, first of all, it helped people pay attention in a kind of intense way, but also what they were imagining was so very different, right? So I mean, you also, you're not hearing the same thing, right? Even though everyone's paying attention to the keywords, but they're constructing a different scene. This is a very scenic kind of radio drama, but they're imagining it so differently. So what's producing that difference? That produces a great conversation, but it is a form of attention. Drawing, it was a form of attention that we were able, that Neil told me how to use, and that worked really well. And it just is a way of talking to yourself in ways that surprise you, I think. I think all the students were surprised at what they came up with.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I'm not surprised that was the end result of that. I think that's what I meant by how does working in the arts make you into a different kind of thinker. It's that's how it's done. It might create fine art, and I want the artists who we train to also have that path. That's really important. That's the thing itself. But that it's, I don't know if it's we should say this about the arts, but they're also useful.
I think so. I mean, I think the way I heard some of what you talked about was that you move off of center stage at various points, and that is an incredibly useful skill to have. It's where you're not, you are released from your own patterns of thought and your own habits and your own, even personal history. Like there's a way that you can pay attention to things, listen to them, look at them, where you somehow remove your grid,
Yeah.
at least temporarily. It's not easy to do, but it actually requires work and training.
It really
right?
does.
And that's one of the useful things. I mean, I think that's very much true for you, Ken, too, in history, is that you do have to, at moments or maybe long stretches of time, let them tell their story to you through the archive, right? And there's a lot of ways one can suppress that by like, well, I know these people did that, or they couldn't have known this, and but you have to, there's a kind of listening that comes out of arts practice and humanistic scholarship that is really helps you with that, and that is frankly quite a useful thing to have in like a faculty meeting or to run a business meeting.
Or how about the world?
All right.
What if like diplomats would actually like
right.
recognize this kind of removing self from center?
Right.
It would be great if everybody drew together and then they could sit down and talk.
Right, because you're also not just dealing with, moving across time 100 years or 200 years, or in many cases in our division, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, but you're also moving across space. What would it mean to be studying, cultures that are very different from your own, and how do you decenter your own cultural grid when you look at something? And you do that. You're not Dutch. You're not Rembrandt's child. You can. I know, darn. One of the things I liked about the poem so much was that you can be in conversation with the curation of the exhibit,
Yeah.
right? So how is the exhibit set up to tell me how to look at this thing, and in what ways do I personally resist that framing, and also what do I learn from that framing, right? It's an enabling framing too, and yet you're very aware of. It only lets you see this.
Yeah, the stage of the curated space is great. And like all I want to do as a poet is just look
behind the scene. Yeah. Yeah. All right, here's a question for both of you again. Can poetry make anything happen? You were kind of backing off from that question.
It's a short and incredibly broad question. It's a pretty profound question.
I think we just decided that it could.
Right, but what does that mean? Like, dig into that. All right, so like William Carlos Williams, poetry doesn't make anything happen, but people die every day for lack of what is found there, right? So he's pointing to some human capacity that we would lose without poetry. But there's many kinds of poetry, and it acts in different way in the world. And so anyway, you can talk about your case. Like, these people believed how did they believe that? Why did they believe it? Or what evidence did they have that was actually true?
Well, I think the tragic part of the answer to that is that people repeatedly find that it's very hard to make anything happen, and that the tools they have are really limited. And I think part of the story that continues to unfurl in the places that are heir to this vision of the poet is, and I think here I study, among other things, the Society of the State of Israel. People, I think mostly there's a story of disenchantment, a sense of discovering over and over again that there are no magic words that can make
something
things
happen.
better.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think there's a different kind of answer, which is that one of the things I think is happening in your poetry is it compels thinking. How much that accomplishes is another kind of question. But the poet, I wonder maybe if the question becomes a question of how you ultimately try and connect to an audience and make them.
Or how much the audience wants to connect to the artwork. History is full of monsters who love fine art.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, it's not going to change anything. But I wonder if we actually truly attend to it on the level that you're talking about, like really thinking with it, really learning with it, really letting it instruct us what its emotional intelligence and its critical thinking. And this would be true of music, dance, fiction, whatever it is, that if we're really doing it, it might allow us to transcend something. But I don't know that everybody does. I think that art is not always consumed it's a holy thing. It's not always consumed in a holy way. It's turned into entertainment sometimes. It's a backdrop of a lot of violence.
On that note, thank you, Robyn.
Thank you.
Overall, this was a very optimistic view
Yeah,
of
why
what the
can't
arts
we
can
say
do.
something happy before?
I know we can't, but
Another
we have
Ross poem?
we have to end this conversation. I am very grateful that you both spent time thinking about these issues before you got here and while you were here, and that's always the delight of conversations with
Thank you so much.
scholars and
Thank you
artists.
for giving us this opportunity. Thank
Yeah,
you.
What fun this is.
So spring, the preservation of culture. Thank you very much.